Section this morning is entitled Non-Objects and World. First of all, I think I'll just introduce both speakers and then we won't have any break up the talks. Okay, so the first speaker today will be Felix doing Phenomenology and Metaphysics of the World on the Ontological Status of Horizon. Felix is a Fulbright scholar, which he held at Fordham from 2010 to 2011. He's published The Time of Revolution, Kairos and Chronos, and Heidegger from Bloomsbury in 2013, A Phenomenology of Christian Life, Indiana University 2013, and The Formation of the Modern Self, Bloomsbury 2022, and he is now working on phenomenological metaphysics with an emphasis on the metaphysica specialis of the self rather than the soul, nature, and divinity. And then our second speaker, Ronny Miron, will speak on the reality of the invisible, the phenomenology of invisibility, and H. Conrad Marcius's metaphysical realism. Dr. Miron teaches at Bar Ilan University, Israel, works in the area of phenomenology and hermeneutics and the relationship, particularly from an interdisciplinary perspective. She republished or had a second edition of her book, A Realist Phenomenology, Hedwig Conrad Marcius. So these are our speakers, and let's welcome Felix, who's the first speaker.
Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here. Before I start, can I invoke two names, if you don't mind, because they're quite relevant to me and also to this paper. Klaus Held was my doctor father, and the first anniversary of his death is coming up in just a couple of weeks. Klaus, as you might not know, is short for Nicholas, so he actually died on the 6th of December. Which was very typical of him, actually. And Laszlo Pengeli, who actually succeeded him in Wuppertal Lehrstuhl, Hungarian philosopher, both of who died much too young, at the age of 60, 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago. I mentioned both of them firstly just because both of them emphasized that phenomenology is about world. Die Sache, Held would always say, is die Welt, right? Die Sache selbst is die Welt, is the world. And also because both are under-translated into English. I think, Gottman has amazing work that we just isn't available in English, and that's a shame. But I wanted particularly here in Duquesne to invoke the Irish bard would always evoke the heroes, right? So that's being the Irish bard here, invoking my heroes in this sanctuary of phenomenology. Okay. If we understand by object a definable thing, that is a thing which can be known in the limits of its being, then we can say that phenomenology is from the beginning a philosophy of non-objects. Or to be more precise, that the basic insight of phenomenology is that an object is never fully there. It appears only archetypally. One way of expressing this is to say that phenomenology is not about objects around the world. This can be understood in respect of horizonality. The appearing of an object refers to an infinity of horizons of that object's appearance, and those horizons of appearance are always already in relation both to the capacity of the perceiver, the I can, and to the appearing of other beings in the world, both as that appearing refers to the orientation of a perceiving subject and to a plurality of conscious and non-conscious entities. Consciousness is itself horizontal in the sense that all acts of consciousness are, from the most basic, occur against the background horizon of sedimented meaning and dormant anticipations. Consciousness draws thereby on immemorial sense constitution and anticipatory directedness. Understood as intentionality, consciousness is rooted in a generative inheritance of sense and an impetus to the satisfaction of drives. Intentional consciousness is founded in instinct, of which reason is its transformed articulation. Instinct, as Spinoza already made clear, and as Levinas rearticulates in another modality, becomes conscious in desire. Most fundamentally, the horizon is world. There is no horizon of world. World is rather given as horizon. In its most fundamental sense, world as horizon is the ground on which all experience and all appearing happens. Its givenness is unique in being non-objective, non-thematic, and even non-intuitive. Okay, so I'm going to, this is in three parts. The first part is going to talk about the notion of horizons, then I'm going to go into this question of instinct that I just alluded to, and then the final part will be a brief conclusion. When we speak of objects, we employ words which signify them through a logic of exclusion, as Aristotle understood the relation of species and genus. This is a logic of clarification and precision. If I say of an apple that it is a round green fruit, I move from the non-indictable to the indictable. As Hegel long since pointed out, it's impossible to point to a fruit as a fruit. Fruit does not exist in the way an apple does. Yet what has happened here is not an abstraction. On the contrary, I intuit the apple as belonging to the category fruit and refine my meaning, become more precise by speaking of an apple, not say an orange. Two other processes are possible. One is abstraction, where instead of making my meaning more concrete, I formalize beyond the species category. So for example, I can say of the apple that it is smooth, hard, or round. In this case, I'm not speaking of that which distinguishes any empirical object, but rather about qualities that are universalizable. In grammatical terms, we can say that we've gone from nouns to adjectives. World, however, is neither a generic category nor a quality. It is grammatically speaking neither a noun nor an adjective. As Solius Geniosus puts it, quote, the world as the totality of objects neither is nor can be the world as horizon, because the totality of objects is itself established in virtue of the pre-givenness of the horizon. World is never given, it is pre-given. It is the originating horizon of things. I would want to add that world is also post-given, in the sense that it forms the space in which it is possible to perceive things as what they are to become. In short, for something to appear is for it to be worldly. World, in other words, is adverbial. To say of something that it appears is to say of it that it is worldly. And this is the most general thing we can say about any entity. But general here to be heard, as I say, adverbially. Not general in the sense of abstraction, but general in the sense of that which every appearing manifests in its appearing. One consequence of this is that world is not an intentional object. World cannot, strictly speaking, be made thematic. It is rather the case that intentionality is an occurrence in the world. Intentionality is a worldly directedness, but is an orientation towards objects as world. Objects, again, say, appear aspectively, are given as present, and can be given appresentively. While world is pre-given, it is always already given, is originally in the sense of never having been present as such. World is at the same time teleological, and I would want to add eschatological, in the sense the world is a condition of everything in coming to be and passing away. It is a basic irreducible fact of the being of objects that they appear as worldly. The world is both a past that was never present and a future that will never be present. The future of objects takes the form of the future perfect. They will have been. There is no place from which the world will have been. Now, it might be objected here, in line with the thesis of Marcus Gabriel, that what this shows is the world simply does not exist. It's got this book here you may be familiar with, kind of polemical book entitled The World Does Not Exist. When we go seeking the world, we do not find anything. What we find, rather, is objects that exist within what Gabriel calls fields of sense. As he puts it, quote, if the world were to exist, it would have to exist in the field of sense, but that is impossible. In such an understanding, world is what we call a specific context in which things can appear to us as meaningful, but this context is not anything existing, but is rather that in which existing things can be made sense of. However, implicit in this, in Gabriel's account, is an overly reductive account of world. We can see this if we pay attention precisely to horizonality. As Anthony Steinbach argues, any attempt to thematize horizons is negation of the initial insight into the horizonality of experience as precisely that which escapes all thematicity. So what Gabriel is trying to do is make thematic what actually cannot be made thematic, and we see that when we recognize its horizonality. The phenomenological point here is to think the doxic relation to horizon as such, and in doing so to think horizon in both the inner and outer senses as the dark movement of coming to appearance of the object, which is the coming to appearance of the object in its manifold aspects, withdraws from appearance and is invisible, unapparent. The horizon has neither the being of consciousness nor of objects, nor is the horizon determinable. The object is given in intuition, but the horizon is not. Rather, the latter is indicated as that which is beyond what is given. The thing is an object of intentional consciousness, but as such an object, it indicates an excess in every perception, which no synthetic act of consciousness, nor any passive synthesis can overcome. Yet, as transcendently given, the horizon constitutes it. Be an object of perception precisely be that which opens up an infinity of possible horizons of its appearance. Horizon, then, is a deeply ambiguous phenomenon. Indeed, it is not so much a phenomenon as constitutive of what it is for something to be a phenomenon. Horizon is a boundary which both limits vision and makes it possible. The horizon opens up a space, but cannot itself be reached. Is a boundary that does not so much define an object as it defines relations. It has, as Merleau-Ponty puts it, a porous being. The point here is not that the horizon is saturated, as Miron claims, but rather that horizons are themselves saturated. The horizon is not infinite through idealization. It is not a limit category, but it rather has a sense of openness, or as Merleau-Ponty puts it, Offenheit, not Unendlichkeit, the infinity of the Lebenswelt, not infinity of idealization, unquote. I wish now to show the inner connection between three ways of speaking about horizon: inner horizon, outer horizon, and world as horizon. And as Neil says, philosophers are really bad imagination when it comes to examples. So I literally was looking out my window as I was writing this. So here goes. The tree outside my window faces away from me as well as towards me. It has horizons of its appearance, but Husserl terms its inner horizons. These horizons are themselves infinite. The object shows itself in an infinity of horizontal trajectories which are constitutive of it. This, for the purpose of this paper, has two significant consequences. First, that intentionality and striving for fulfillment can never be fully satisfied. The object of intentionality outstrips intuition. The object as it appears as that which is in an infinity of relations beyond the finitude of my perception. As such, the fulfillment of my intentional consciousness is a fulfillment only relative to the finitude of my specific experiential needs. Furthermore, the object as it appears is not alone an object for me, this tree outside my window, but this object for me, but as this object for me, it surpasses me and transcends towards an unending plurality of others. The appearance of the tree outside my window is constituted by its appearing towards the shrub beneath it, the sparrow alighting on it, the soil in which its roots are sunk, the clouds floating above it. Its appearing to me happens through this ongoing relationality. The inner horizon of the relational capacity of the object, the inner horizon is the relational capacity of the object, but this relational capacity is itself subject to the relational positions of others. The interplay of these relational positions constitute outer horizons, horizons which relate in a dynamic overlapping with one another. Husserl speaks of this as the relation of of the inner horizon, but then when we think about the kind of relationality, it's total relationality. Husserl speaks in terms of Lebenswelt. It talks in terms of Lebenswelt in terms of home and alien world. But those very terms are themselves fundamentally relational. No world is as such a home world or an alien world. More broadly, one might speak of relational networks constituted by habituation, but also disturbance, familiarity, and surprise. My intentional consciousness gives implicit primacy to familiarity and normality. But if the object is constituted through an infinity of relations, then any object can be the source of surprise and disturbance. Or rather, the horizonality constitutive of the object is meaningful, opens up a continual possibility of such disturbance. A quote Husserl from Experience and Judgment: the existence of anything real never has any other sense than that of existence in. To be real is to exist within the horizon of the world. The inner and outer horizons of the object show its ultimate relationality to the world as the horizon of all horizons. But there would be a misunderstanding, and Husserl sometimes falls into this misunderstanding, to think of such a horizon, the horizon of all horizons, as in some sense the absolute outer limit of things. To say of the real that it exists in the world is not to say that it is held within a container. It is rather to say that every happening of world is horizon, is always in the process of transcending itself. It is in that sense that world is infinite. It is in that sense that world is infinite, as Tingley says. This is a happening of phenomena which is finite in the sense of being within a horizon, but always Janus-like, turned within and without. What intentionality shows is that consciousness is always directed beyond itself. For consciousness, the consciousness is a general term for specific acts and not an inner domain. In other words, what it shows is that subjectivity is manifest in a continual movement of self-transcendence. But what our intentional consciousness discloses are objects themselves in their relations of self-transcendence. Intentional consciousness is a striving towards fulfillment, but is never fulfilled because the object of the intentional consciousness is itself in a process of transcendence. Not alone is my consciousness directed towards objects, but those objects are directed towards me, and through the horizon in which I find myself. And it is transcending itself. The object is in countless horizontal trajectories and is being transcended towards from countless viewpoints. As worldly objects show themselves to be constantly transcending themselves towards that which is no object at all, namely world as horizon. Okay, so that was the first part. Now I want to go into trying to think about this from a particular type of structure of consciousness, namely instinct. The openness, which is the being of the world as horizon, makes not alone the object of perception possible, but also any perceiving of that object. Husserl speaks in this context of the passive pre-givenness correlating to a passive belief, so the doxa. The world is not an object of judgment, but is rather the condition of all experience. All acts of consciousness, to quote from Experience and Judgment, already presuppose consciousness of the world in the certainty of belief, unquote. But this consciousness of the world differs from a consciousness of an object because it is pre-thematic and indeed pre-intuitive. At this level, the world is nothing I experience, but rather is the ground of my experience. The indistinctness of world is already prefigured by the instinctual being of the subject. I want to try to clarify here. Already in the logical investigations, Husserl speaks about instinct and desire and remarks on the indeterminateness of their objects. Desire, he remarks, quote, this is from logical investigations, does not always seem to require conscious reference to what is desired, unquote. That, quote, we are often moved by obscure drives or pressures towards unrepresented goals, unquote. and concludes that instincts, quote, are characterized by an indeterminateness of objective direction. In a later manuscript from 1930, he speaks of the animal subject, which he characterizes as, quote, subject of its pre-given surrounding world and subject of its drive habitualities, of its acquired direction toward. Instinct, he says, is an empty intention, characterized by a lack of any prefiguring of what would satisfy. This is only what would satisfy is only disclosed retrospectively once fulfillment has been achieved. What is characteristic of instinct is that it is directed at nothing specific. My hunger, for example, to use his example, is not a craving for a particular dish, but is more a general directedness towards whatever it may be that will satisfy this instinct. Two related aspects of instinct are evident here: its normativity and its teleology. Our basic drives are constitutive of our norms in the sense that they are evaluative, discriminating, and guiding. Hunger, for example, gives an evaluative worth to something as being food and as such fulfilling for this instinct. It distinguishes between what counts and what does not count as satisfying that evaluation, and it guides our actions in that respect. Furthermore, our instincts drive us towards fulfillment, give a teleological structure to our consciousness. While instincts are subject to rational reflection, for Husserl, this does not involve a stepping out of the instinctual structure itself. Husserl speaks of the drive of reason, the Vernunftstreben, drive of reason, because reason is a higher drive, seeking fulfillment in the same structure as instinct. But if this is the case, then reason shares with instinct a fundamental indeterminateness of objective direction. It must, in the same sense as our basic instinct, it strives for fulfillment, but not for a particular object of fulfillment. Such fulfillment, and then only partial, is recognized retrospectively. But as with hunger, what we have here is only a partial fulfillment. Now, there's much that could be said about the question of instinct, both in Husserl and more generally phenomenologically, but I want to pick up two salient issues with regard to world and horizon. First, in recognizing my instinctive drivenness, I recognize it as pre-given, specifically in what Husserl calls my animal subjectivity. What I recognize, therefore, is my conscious self, my ego, is subject to an underlying drivenness, which is constitutive of my worldliness. My instinctive life connects me into a temporal horizon, which indicates horizons generative of me, but so sedimented in me that they remain closed to it. Secondly, through emphatic comprehension of another, I can see the same drivenness expressed in the bodily being of others. I see this, for example, in the cat lapping up its milk, but I also see it in the birch tree, stretching its branches and roots through the spring and summer. In my emphatic apprehension of such entities, I appresent in that instinctive directedness, disclosing a world in which objects receive their sense for these entities. In the entity that I see, whether it's the cat or the birch tree, in seeing it, is traced its world, of which it is not an object for me or for it, but through which I see not alone that entity as it appears, but also myself in the world of that entity. I'll begin with the second point and then go to the first. The horizonality of worldly appearing indicates a fundamental exposure of subjectivity with respect to world. To perceive is already to be constituted horizontally. To perceive is already to be perceived. This is inherent, obviously, in the embodiment of the perceiver. As Husserl states, the constitution of the body is radically incomplete for subjective consciousness because the gap at the heart of double intentionality. My body switches between perceiving and perceived. It pivots towards, but also away from me, remains hidden from me. What is hidden from me, however, is exposed to others, not simply human others, but to dogs, cows, bacteria, viruses, the sand on which I lie, the pollen which enters into my nostrils. My exposure is horizontal in the sense that the manifestation of my being occurs within an infinity of horizons in which such entities approach, perceive, irritate, and enter me. This level of my horizontal worldly being resonates in me at the most fundamental instinctive level. Now, I could use an example here of a hungry lion and myself as a prey, but I thought just so soon after breakfast that would be a rather gruesome example. So I'm going to do something much more everyday. So let's say I'm walking through a forest and I see a squirrel scampering towards me carrying an acorn. In that squirrel, I see relations of from coming from over there towards approaching me, outer, appearing in the forest at its habitat, for the purpose of, I recognize it as engaged in the pursuit of food consistent with its habitual existence. These relations are those in which I find myself suddenly entwined, because my initial perception of this animal is interrupted when it catches sight of me, and I am transformed without my doing into a threatening presence. In the bodily expression of the squirrel, I see its hunt for food curtailed and its instinct for survival becoming dominant. In recognizing this instinctual shift, I see myself as seen from the squirrel's place, and I see myself as a threatening being. My clumsy response of softly cooing to it prompts it to scamper away, and the situation appears to me in all of its comedy. Seeing myself as the threatening presence for this squirrel, I can also see the objects of the forest constituted now through the horizontal being of the squirrel. Branches, undergrowth, entities such as me become transformed through this instinctual shift. So I see them now as so many pathways and so many promising pathways and obstacles for the instinctual life of the squirrel. Taken further beyond this particular entity, the emphatic sense of instinctual life places me within an interrelation of various instinctual worlds, including those of bacteria and viruses that I cannot see, but whose movements can be demonstrated to me. Horizons of my bodily being, including the workings of my gut that remain for the most part beyond my constituting consciousness, form worlds for bacteria. This horizontal structure makes possible regions of sense which are in real terms cut off from me. The sense constitution of a bacteria's world, for example, I can only, in the most general terms, recognize. These instinctual worlds form the modes of orientation of entities from bacteria to oak trees to human beings. But this does not imply the reduction of consciousness to genetic material. It does not, in other words, mean a naturalization in terms of objects within chains of causal relation. On the contrary, what Husserl in effect sees here is that what we find in the instinctual life of the human subject is the working out in explicit and rational terms that which is already present implicitly and irrationally in animal being, including ourselves. In other words, all animal being is directed towards the world as the horizon not alone of its being, but the horizon through which it transcends itself towards other worlds. A movement of transcendence limited contingently, but in absolute terms infinite. And we can see this. By drawing out the implications of Husserl's statement that, and I'm quoting this. This is from Grundprobleme de Phenomenology, the Husserliana F42. Reason itself is transformed instinct. Instinctive activity and intention permeates through all rational life. Unquote. Reason is structured instinctively. It is evaluative and teleological in structure, but is a transformation of instinct. The drive to make sense of our environment is not peculiar to human beings, but is an underlying animal, and I would want to add vegetal structure. Understood as instinctual, this does not require consciousness. It is indeed primarily an unconscious drive, also in human beings. With regard to the past, the effect of this, what Husserl calls universal drive intentionality, is the linking of attention with attention, unifying the retained and the ongoing present. Through this process, repetitions emerge, and the objects of our instinctual drives become evident. But this is a retrospective process, whereby in reflection we give objective form to what had been empty intentions of instinctual drives. The blind instinct becomes partially sighted. Reason works through such retrospective formalizations of instinctive relations, and also works teleologically, in that reason strives to reach that fulfillment, prefigured instinctively. But reason does not give the ultimate object of our striving, but rather directs itself to the world as the happening of the telos of such striving. While instincts can be satisfied, the nature of instinct is its restlessness. A good meal can still my instinctive drive for food, but I know that that drive will return. Such restlessness is manifest in general terms as desire. Levinas, at the beginning of Totality and Infinity, contrasts desire with need. To quote him, I can feed on these realities and to a very great extent satisfy myself. Their alterity is thereby reabsorbed into my own identity as a thinker or as a possessor. Metaphysical desire desires above everything that can simply complete it. The desired does not fulfill it, but deepens it. And I know for Levinas, this we also argue is alterity as opposed to world. What I want to argue is that world has precisely this alterity built into it. What instinct shows is generality, not this or that food, but the relation to the world in which the self is directed at objects as appearing to them, as awakening their instinct, in conscious terms igniting the desire. The desire ignited is not, however, a relation to this particular object, but to the horizonal being which is constituted of, but irreducible to the object. Okay, so let me just, in this final part, just very briefly try to kind of bring some implications of what I've been trying to say and end with some kind of a theological point. The ring of Galway's myth remains a constant temptation for Western philosophy. The temptation, namely, of worldlessness. Indeed, one can understand consciousness in its classical formulation, from Descartes through to Kant, as nothing other than a universalization of this myth of Galway's in the cognizing subject. From the interiority of consciousness, we can observe without being observed. One might be forgiven for thinking that the phenomenological reduction is simply a radicalization of this tendency. There are works in secondary literature that precisely want to say this, but I hope we'll all agree this is a misunderstanding. In such a view, in pure consciousness reduction, is nothing other than precisely this kind of a radicalization of this kind of viewing things from a worldless place. But this, as I say, misconstrues reduction, in particular forgets phenomenology's orientation to the world. And we can understand this in three respects. First, consciousness, as disclosed through the reduction, is a general term for acts. Acts are directed towards the world and as such are worldly. Secondly, the acts of consciousness are constituted not simply by their relations to objects, but more fundamentally to the world as that which makes objects possible for consciousness. Thirdly, the worldliness of the object is as much the worldliness of the subject. In fact, both subject and object are fundamentally worldly, which is to say that both emerge from world. As emerging from world, the subject is only in a restricted sense primary to the analysis, and the correlation of subject and object is derivative from a more fundamental phenomenological reality. This can be summed up by saying that phenomenon is not what appears for a subject or to a subject, but rather an event in which the subject emerges as a contingent situated entity within an originary situation. Phenomenology, as the discourse of the appearing of appearing, is directed fundamentally at this situation. Phenomenon is not what appears to me, but rather is the event of appearing more originary than any subject or any object. I find myself in an affective relationality which is not primarily a matter of objects in the world, but rather the infinite horizons of effective relation through which any such entities, myself included, appear. Through this relational happening, I see myself as being in the phenomenon, not simply being the addressee or the subject of the phenomenon. What we see here is that the self is not fundamentally the nominative subject of Husserl's, perhaps of Husserl's static phenomenology, nor even the accusative or the dative subject of Levinas or Miron, but rather the locative subject. The self recognizes itself as located within the happening and the phenomenon, and is being constituted in its being through this location, which it can only modify. The self as locative is the self understood in the horizonal being of the world, all appearing whether to, of, with, or without this self is a happening of world. In desire, the self becomes conscious of its directedness towards, beyond all objects, towards the world as transcendence. The world alone is the unconditional, das Unbedingte in German, so the unthing. The desire is directed at origins and ends, which become articulated in the twin myths of creation and eschaton. So in its relation to the unbedingt, to the unconditioned, the desire is directed both in terms teleologically and in terms of origins. This gets expressed, and this is kind of to end with kind of the theological point, in the myths of creation and eschaton. But such directionality is not for that which is beyond the world, but for the world as such. We might say, in quoting the prayer of glorification, the world without end. In that sense, contrary to Feuerbach, theology does not become anthropology, but in the strict sense, cosmology. If the experience of God for Schleiermacher is one of absolute dependence, it is precisely in the experience of world that we find this. World not naturalized to mere causal dependence, but world rather as the infinite horizon of which no greater can be thought. And the amor Dei is at its roots an amor mundi. Thank you much. Yes.
Toward the end, you made a very striking claim, I think, which is, if I got it right, first of all, a great presentation of what world is and horizon and how they're related. But then I finally saw that what you were working toward, or one of the things we're working toward, is denying that the self is original.
Right.
Self derives from world.
Yeah.
Now, this isn't to say that that's incorrect, but I believe Husserl would disagree, especially, and I don't know what to say about that. I just wanted to kind of confirm that. And maybe I shouldn't even say this, but I guess I didn't find that the considerations you brought in, I thought were relevant, but not totally convincing. I don't know if it means anything to say that way. I guess, so I don't mean this as a conclusive criticism, but I guess my only comment is everything you said, I didn't quite see how everything you said about world, though relevant, I didn't see how that really finally conclusively established what I think is one of your central claims, namely the self is not original, but the self derives from the horizon of the world.
Right. Yeah.
Am I right about my?
Yeah, you are. I mean, well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm pushing Husserl to where he certainly wouldn't want to go, right? And so you're absolutely right in that. And I don't think I proved my point here. It's more I'm kind of trying to point towards it. I guess what I would say is, I mean, it depends how we understand stuff to be, right? And my reading of phenomenology is that we start with the subject, like the first person perspective, but we don't end there, right? The point of phenomenology is not to end with the first person perspective, and it's not even to end with intersubjectivity. And my kind of claim is where it ends is in recognizing the worldliness of all things. And that there is a priority, right? There is a priority of the subject, but that priority is very relative. Priority is in terms of reason in Husserl's terms, right?
In terms of, I'm sorry.
Reason. So there's capacity for reason. I mean, how I read what phenomenology is doing is basically phenomenology is its basic concern is to re-articulate what we mean by reason. And that's where, but what our reason shows us is that directedness to world, which is constituted not just for our objects, but for us ourselves. And that was the point I was trying to make in terms of exposure, right? That if the in contrast to, say, the Cartesian subject, who's radically unexposed, right? The subject that we get from Husserl is radically exposed, right? And this is the point where he says, right, that the body is incompletely constituted. We cannot constitute our own bodies. Our bodies are only constituted through the relationality to others. And if that's true, and if the embodied self is fundamental, right? So in other words, you don't have a self beyond the body is fundamental to the self, then my claim will want to be what that shows is that the self which reasons, the self which perceives is itself, what it recognizes is that it is itself constituted horizontally. And if that's true, then it's constituted in a worldly sense.
Yeah, I guess the one other thing is that it raises a really interesting question of what does the subject derive from? And then another question to you, which I don't want to dwell too long, but is it adequate, and this is a theological question too, is it adequate to say it simply derives from the world, or, well, like Henri says, from God directly? So,
and that then depends what we understand God to be, and I mean, just to be very, just to put my cards on the table here, there's a certain kind of pantheism that's kind of deriving from this, right? But yeah.
So you started out by saying that the world is neither noun nor adjective, and then later on you referenced other grammatical terms, dative, for instance. But I noticed that during the squirrel example, you highlighted the horizonality of that situation with prepositions. Would you say that is the grammatical nature of the horizon then, is prepositional?
I mean, I would say both, right? I mean, so what the prepositions give us is the kind of locative sense, right? And so, but the world is I want to say, is a happening. It's something that happens, right? So the squirrel example, right? This is a happening of relationality, and the prepositional relations depend upon that prior happening, and in that sense, it's adverbial before it's preposition. You might say, yeah.
I wanted to ask you about the unity of reason. And I want to say that it was a wonderful talk. Thank you. Yeah, but it's hard to derive the unity of reason out of logical considerations. Is it derivable? Would you see that it can be derived out of the unity of the world horizon? And if so, which it seems to me you are doing, how do we establish the unity of the world? Because there is a big conversation, right? Whether we can establish the unity of reality of the life world and reality of microphysical world. So how do we work this? And I also have a second question, which maybe I'll put out right now and then we can work them together. In Vedanta, the whole task of enlightenment, the first one is the unity of reason and the unity of the will. And the second one concerns Vedantic attempts to achieve enlightenment by annulling the reality of the world
Mm.
completely,
Mm.
and everything which goes with it,
Mm.
intentionality, positing on one's own body or one's own history, so it's both self and non-self,
Mm.
the package
Mm.
which has to be thrown away.
Mm.
Do you think that it's possible? And if it's done this way, whether anything remains on which one can build
Mm.
this idea of immortality, enlightenment, complete happiness,
Mm.
and yeah.
Mm. Mhm. Okay. Yeah, two really important and difficult questions. I mean, I'll start with the first one. I mean, the unity of, yeah, I mean, to me, it's the nature of reason is to seek that unity, right? And so and we think about it in terms of, say, the micro world, right? I mean, that's kind of like the basic point one has to make, is that there are two realities here, right? There's not the world which of quantum physics, which somehow is separate from the world in which we are. These worlds belong together in some way, and that was the point I was trying to make on a different level in terms of, say, the bacteria in my gut, right? I mean, that's not something I can see. It's not something I can perceive, but nonetheless, there is a constitutive sense there, right? I mean, bacteria are, I mean, obviously they're not, well, let's assume they're not conscious, right? They're not in the sense that we are conscious, but nonetheless, they are directed towards certain things, and they evaluate certain things, right, in terms of what's going on in my gut and so on. So that there's worlds of sense there that are happening all around us, right? And I guess the point of reason and the point of philosophy in the end is to find the unity of that. And the way I think we do this is to recognize that the object of reason is world, right? And therefore the object of reason is to see everything in terms of its relation to everything else.
Okay.
That I think is what. Now, and in terms of the question of enlightenment, I have to think about that. I mean, it is that's really tricky. I mean, I guess my instinct would be to say that what happens there is precisely world, right? It is precisely world, like so that the kind of the attempt kind of to lose oneself in a unity, to break down those distinctions is a kind of a nothingness, but that nothingness was precisely, I mean, again, thinking in Heideggerian terms, right? The world is nothing in that sense, right? Because what one sees there, I mean, that's, I think, Heidegger's analysis of anxiety, right, is that when one finds, one recognizes like the meaninglessness that Heidegger gets through anxiety, is not a denial that there is meaning, but is a recognition that meaning it depends on something, on world, which is not one other thing. It's not another thing that gives it that meaning. It's rather that the true way that the meaning is. So that's kind of in the direction.
No, I see how you were doing it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I might meet you, Michael, actually, because there's a lot of other people. So I think Neil, yeah.
Just really quick, thank you for the paper. I mean, it illuminates quite a bit about the relation between world and horizon. So, and also the inner horizon that the phenomenon has itself. I feel a very Heideggerian gesture in the way that you solve the question between the relation between subject and object, whereas to propose a kind of ontological unity instead of trying to solve the epistemological problem that we see in Kant. Heidegger goes around and offers an ontological solution that joins Dasein and world in a way in which they're united from the very beginning. I wonder if you want to say more about that kind of solution that you offer and how you differentiate it from Heidegger. I don't hear an existential kind of solution that solves the question of meaning for Dasein or the subject, but if you could say probably a little bit more about the kind of solution that you offer and how it differentiates from what Heidegger showed as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I mean, I did the Heidegger, and he keeps on haunting me, right? So every time, every time I think I'm saying something that's kind of new, somebody in the audience points out to me, well, isn't this Heidegger? So thank you for doing that. But I guess, I mean, I guess where I see the distinction is with the notion of the infinite, right? Is that world for me is infinite. And again, I'm getting like Pengelly in his book on Weltun Unendlichkeit. I think this is really the point he tries to make. And therefore, what Levinas sees as infinity, right? Is not simply the other in Levinas. So it's not simply the ethical relation in and then how we read Levinas is another question, right? But assuming at least a very kind of simple kind of dichotomy between totality and infinity, and totality being world and infinity being the other. I think what I would want to say is that the world has that infinity, that what Levinas sees in the other is precisely what how world is constituted.
Infinity of the world.
Yeah. So that would be the kind of direction I want to go.
No, that's very helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for a really interesting paper. I guess kind of going off the first question. So I'm interested in this idea of the locative subject, and so you're kind of saying the self maybe emerges from world, but are you thinking that this world without some, I mean, is a world without a self or subject? Or are you also kind of talking about maybe there are horizons for animality or vegetality? It's a world, yeah, I guess, is there a world without any kind of life or something like that?
I mean, I think there's no world without relation, right? Relation, so, and the relation, I mean, what I'm trying to think is the relation coming before the relation, which is always kind of difficult to think, right? But that's what so that's, I mean, in broad terms, that's what I'm trying to think, right? So the world of relationality as primary to the relation. And
so you would have to have there would have to be a self or subject for there to be the relation.
Yeah, but it depends what you mean by that. I mean, we were talking for the conference we had about, you know, what about the amoeba, right? What does the amoeba? And I would want to say, yeah, the amoeba is that which relates, right? It's not a subject in the sense that we think of a subject, but on the other hand, it's fundamental to us, and that was kind of the sedimented meaning I was trying to say. But if we could really do this phenomenologically, we should be able to think right back to us, to write back our evolutionary story, right back to its origins, right? And in that kind of empathetic way, kind of think through a relationality which is prior to us, and also a relationality that is posterior to us. And that's why, like, you know, somebody like Miller-Sue in the notion of ancestrality, I think he's, I mean, it's a challenge, but I don't think it's as challenging as he thinks it is to phenomenology. I think phenomenology can precisely work its way back to that kind of ancestral primacy.
Neil?
Yeah, to follow up on Peter's last question a little bit, and some of the other ones. I'm wondering about two things, but the first one, maybe I'll stick with this one. The relationship between your project as you're articulating it here and Michel Henry. Because it seems like very similar in ways that I think are productive and like really helpful, right? But I'm thinking especially of Michel Henry in Barbarism, where he talks about the world as, you know, the shared body of life, basically, where he talks about the relationship between earth and world. And this is the other part of my question from Husserl, is how your account of world and horizons relates to what he says about earth, right? The relationship between earth and world as a sort of absolute horizon and stuff. Because I think how you answer that Husserl question leads then into the possible similarities with, like I think Henri gives us a way of answering the relation to earth that then lets us see the world as fundamentally saturated with life,
right,
to use those kind, and in which case then all these other things you're talking about, wanting the world as an infinite horizon of dependence, the horizon of affective relationships, all of those things take on a different tincture cast in Henri's light of life. And then for the theological project as well that you gestured towards at the end, there's promising ways forward from that.
That's very helpful. I'm not sure I can say a lot at the moment, but I mean, I have a very kind of fractured relationship with Henri because I kind of the Gnosticism in Henri I really try to avoid, right? And I think precisely in the Barbarism book he's moving away from that in a way, right? And trying to see this relationship in world and life. And I agree. I mean, I think that would be productive. I don't have a lot more to say about that, but in terms of Earth in Husserl and how that might link in, yeah. I mean, because precisely, right? I mean, the Earth in Husserl is that kind of that constituting horizon, right? The Earth doesn't move, right? It's kind of like that without which, you know. But again, then what I want to understand. Where I worry about that is that Husserl's tendency to say, right, well, that's then kind of like that's the foundation, that's the ultimate foundation, right? And I think then one's not one's understanding horizon in a non-horizonal sense, right? Because a horizon precisely cannot be the ultimate foundation, and so I need to think more about that. Yeah.
I think we got one over here. We've only got like, we got 3 minutes.
Okay, not so much a question with a couple of random thoughts. I'm finding a powerful urge to go to Whitehead, but I'll resist. What is interesting to me is a kind of a quasi Jeff view, using merely instead of intentionality going all the way down, desire goes all the way down. When we've talked about this before, the world exists because it likes it, it wants to. And so the amoeba desires something, and so our desire is just an instantiation of ontological desire.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. That's kind of where I'm trying to go with this. Yeah.
Okay.
At the risk of asking a somewhat big question, I'll try to just keep this brief. We talked about pre-H philosophy, Heidegger and Henri. Could I ask about H4, which is Hegel's project in relation to yours?
Yeah. Can you be more specific?
Well, there seems to be because you also pointed out when you were talking about a certain pantheistic tendency with a certain more mundi world progress in a way that seems kind of reminiscent to me of the progress towards absolute idea or something like that, and how his sort of system tends to have that cosmological focus as opposed to an anthropological one. And so I figured I'd just ask, how you kind of see the relationship there. I'm not admittedly very well read, so I've probably already made a mistake, but
I mean, my only kind of sense is I think the infinite as I'm understanding it, I think Hegel would think is a bad infinite, right? And I think that's the problem for Hegel, not for me, right? In the sense that I think that's what phenomenology shows. I mean, that we're dealing with an interaction of teleologies, right? And that's radically contingent, right? There's not an ultimate absolute telos that we're heading towards. This is and that's kind of the pantheistic that I was pointing to. It's a pantheism. It's a relational pantheism, right? So it's not a pantheism in a kind of a Spinozistic sense, but rather the telos we're aiming. But that's like what I was trying to say. That telos is not an object, right? I think that's the problem with Hegel, right? That we make the telos into this absolute object. Whereas when I was talking about the unbedingt in German, I really want to hear that unconditional in the linguistic, in the etymological sense, right? It's the unthing, right? There is no, the unconditional is not a thing. It is, and that's, I mean, where Husserl talks about the instinct as not having, that the object of the instinct is not pre-familiar, right? I mean, so it's, we don't in the origin see the end, right? We're working towards an end that's always, that we're always surpassing, that always transcending itself. So and then that sense, I think for Hegel, bad infinite. Okay.
Maybe.
Yeah, take a second.
Because I thought we could continue. We don't have time anymore.
Oh.
We don't, it's okay.
It's
I
10
can
o'clock, I
continue
think.
as
Yeah, it's
we-
10:01. Let's, you can carry on the discussion otherwise, okay? Thank you. Thank
Okay,
you.
no.
Yes.
So I start with thanking all the organizers of this wonderful conference. First and foremost, Olga and Jeff, and this marvelous discussion we just to take home and continue reflecting and exploring. And also for the opportunity to think again, to rethink, as we always do in phenomenology, our already allegedly acquired understandings via new perspective that unveil so many obscurities and so many richness beyond the really initial clarity that soon transpires as something which is about to vanish in a minute. So we are there. So you don't count the time that you are. Because I've been shortening the paper. I don't want to tell you how long time it took me to shorten it, so.
And unfortunately, it's the slowest computer that's ever been.
It's customary in universities. They
Yeah.
just, there are museums of old computers. I know this, I know the problem.
Yesterday is technology 10 years from now.
Why rush into the last version of the computer?
Sure. Yes, now that's too small. That is an hybrid.
See. Maybe it is here.
Yeah.
Here. This one. And we have a seat right there, it's on screen, so maybe. And you don't touch it liquid, so I'm ready to go. Okay, so, so here is the volume that was in my presentation. So I'll start with the obvious that phenomenology is traditionally associated with the study of what is present and appears to our consciousness as an object, also frequently referred to as the given. However, as we have seen in so many presentations in dissertations in this conference, phenomenology is no less hunted also by the complex presence of the invisible, encompassing certain dimensions that remain unseen but are still operated within the world of phenomena. The seeds of the search for the invisible are already implied in Dilthey's work, who maintain that objects studied by human scientists are more than mere physical entities and possess an invisible depth, hinting at the concealed processes and forces within human reality. This view is also apparent in Dilthey's idea of historical understanding, verstehen, as engaging materials possessing more than one meaning. The next foundational step to be mentioned in this regard is Husserl's method of essence intuition. This method addressed the intimate self-being an individual and thereby discloses to us what it is, a whatness that according to Husserl can be set out as an idea. In what follows, I wish to explore an approach to phenomenology of invisibility in reality, while philosophizing along with to draw on the concept of Sphinx concept, the realist phenomenologist Ludwig Konrad Martius. In other words, the study of the phenomenon of the invisibility that I'm going to outline here guides my reading of Konrad Martius's writings. Konrad Martius was one of the leading figures of the Munich-Göttingen circle, whose members belonged to the first generation of phenomenology contemporary with Husserl. I once knew each of them who is who, but I'm not sure anymore about that. So the circle included a few young intellectuals and philosophers from the University of Munich, who in 1911 went to Göttingen to attend the courses of Husserl and also Adolf Reinach, then a professor there who had already risen to prominence with the publication of Logical Investigations. This book, Husserl first articulated his resounding call of go back to the thing in themselves. This call aimed to direct attention to whatever appears in consciousness, emphasizing that it should be approached, stood on its own terms, without invoking any external categories. The philosophers from Munich adopted Husserl's method of essence intuition, which they understood as a primary means of responding to his resounding call. Konrad Martius described this method as follows. It is a meaning that lies within the thing itself, with which it stands and falls, independent of any human knowledge. That is why I speak of meaning of being. However, to be able to see this meaning, one must possess a spiritual organ attuned to the essence of things, corresponding to them in the same way that the sense of sight corresponds to colors and the sense of sounds. Similarly, one either sees eidos or one does not. Husserl's doctrine of the study of essences served as a starting point for Konrad Martius's ontological inquiries, which sought to delve into the meaning of the mere presence of beings in the world. Unlike Husserl, who after his turn towards transcendental idealism placed the subjective consciousness at the center of investigations and expanded it to the point that it appears to swallow the entire sphere of objects into itself, Konrad Martius centered her investigations on essence as an ontological element whose disclosure she considered as the key to understanding the world and reality as a whole. Moreover, Konrad Martius and her colleagues from the Munich-Göttingen circle turned their back on epistemological efforts and identified themselves as confirmed realists. In particular, Konrad Martius responded to this shift in Husserl thought by bringing attention to what she referred to as the paradox of being, which concerns the very fact and that the natural thing possesses being and sustains itself within being. Thus, instead of what she regarded as Husserl's transformation of the real world into noematic world, Konrad Martius asked, but where does the world remain? This question, encapsulating the core of her metaphysical realism that courses throughout her entire philosophical work, was guided by another all-inclusive question articulated at the beginning of Ontological from 1923, later to be considered as her magnum opus, what is reality? This broad sketch, I just, as always, when we sketch something so generally, we don't do that just to more particularities, but there is a lot to say about the complex way in which the members of the Göttingen circle received Husserl logical investigations. There is an entire debate what they, if they actually understood it or read their own agenda into this book, and it's never ending. But to be sure, I think all of them are right. I mean, the Munich-Göttingen circle have their point when they realize that the problematic consequences of the shift of the emphasis on epistemological matters, and also those who said that Husserl was not simply a realist in logical investigation have also a lot to lean off. But we just are not just now displaying the kind of the prejudice regarding that debate in the history of phenomenology. So this broad sketch of Konrad Matus's realist attention provides an essential framework for engaging with the question of the invisible in her thinking. In the first place, Konrad Matus observes two simultaneous occurrences within the real being. The first occurrence, addressing the real being outwards, concerns its acquiring a description and an appearance, and involving taking part in space. However, Konrad Matus explained that in this turning outside, the real being does not cut off of its interior realm. Rather, it still hovers from within itself, carried by its interiority that is held and preserved outside itself while remaining within its living possession. This occurrence allowed the real being to sustain itself beyond itself, what she later referred to as the peculiar capability for infrastasis. I will refer to it later. The other occurrence, referred to as substantializations inward, indicate the distinctive immersion of the entire body of being into the respective entity without becoming something completely externally determined. In any case, neither the externalization nor in the internalization that occurs within the real being reaches full exhaustion. Instead, they act as two tangential forces that intersect within reality. Konrad Matus clarifies that her interest is not directed towards physical optical regularities or what can be seen or perceived through a strictly natural scientific lens. Rather, her focus is on the idea of reality, namely the internal essence of the real, which can be revealed through the method of essence, intuition. So against this general background, the structure of my presentation will proceed as follows. We have just completed the introduction section. We now proceed to displaying three ontological structures from Konrad Matus's writing: nothingness, selfness, selfhood, and or also it's not selfhood, it should be selfness, and transcendence. Each of the three is marked by a tension between the external and internal. It is my intention to argue that these ontological structures pertain to the phenomenon of the invisible. Next, the discussion section will elaborate on the web of connections between the three through the lens of invisibility, and the epilogue will attempt to ascend to an understanding of invisibility as a fundamental operative dimension within reality. So we proceed now to the ontological structure of nothingness. In Real-Ontologie, Konrad Matus establishes the most primordial framework for her philosophy of reality, arguing that the sole philosophically meaningful difference that distinguishes between existence and concerns the primordial contradiction between existence and nothingness. The opposition of these two elements is depicted as absolute and devoid of any conceivable transition from one element to the other. Having recognized the nothingness, that nothingness is an indispensable factor within reality, Konrad Matus proceeds to establish its its positive existence, so to speak, yes, the positive existence of the nothing. In this regard, she contends that not only does the difference between existence and non-existence concerns the roots out of which everything springs forth, but also she depicts real being as elevating themselves from non-existence or mere ideal and formal existence into being. In this regard, the verb elevation suggests that there was something there from which the related elevation occurs. Later in her treatise, Being and Nothing from Sein und Nichts from 1931, she would seek to explore what is inside into nothingness, out of nothingness, surrounded by nothingness, within nothingness. In employing these spatial expressions, Konrad Martius lays the most elementary foundation for establishing the nothingness in question as a mode of being, henceforth signified by a capital N. She put it as follows. As soon as being sets boundaries towards nothingness, as soon as it includes even the possibility of non-being in any way, it stands in its groundless in this radical sense, not in itself, but in nothingness. It does not rise from itself, but from nothingness. Konrad Martius goes so far as to argue that it is not the nothing, but the existent being that turns questionable to the point of regarding the real being as a burden imposed upon the primordial nothing. She puts it again as follows. How does such burden enter the midst of nothingness? What a paradox, even an impossibility. How can nothingness bear this something? Where does it derive the strength, the possibility to exist within non-being? How does it gain its place of its being? How can there be even a place of a being within the immeasurability of non-being? Nonetheless, Konrad Martius comes to conclude that only the groundless foundation, the immeasurable and boundless starting within oneself is not a metaphysical contradiction and is fully understandable. Furthermore, I would say that for Konrad Martius, what is the most radical, inspiring, igniting force is the drama of the real. How it elevates itself out of nothingness and turn out to be a real being. We'll see that later. Furthermore, existence or being is juxtaposed with nothing to the point that as much as it makes no sense to discuss a negative being, it is impossible to account for a negative nothing. It is exactly the positivity qualifying its comprising elements that turns the distinction between existence and the nothing into a genuine difference. Certainly, the difference between being and nothing is not dismissed therein. Rather, their positive establishment can first enable their philosophical consideration. Next, after establishing the distinction between being and nothingness and affirming the latter's positivity as an entity in its own right, Konrad Martius proceeds to substantiate the bond between being and nothingness. This move indicates that the relationship between existence and non-existence is not exhausted by the latter merely being prior or in the background of existence. Rather, Konrad Martius' discussion of the concept of the abyss, Grund, as a constitutive element within reality suggests that nothingness is not left behind real being, but is instead preserved around. The ontological bond between the nothing and the existing being is made tangible by various expressions, all aimed at depicting the real being, such as resting on the ground on abyss, carried out in the abyss, expanded in the abyss within which it is filled, a fullness as a fulfillment of the abyss, and a spatial wedding of the material being with the boundless abyss. This fundamental view of the abyss allows to serve as an ontological foundation for real beings, indicating to a pervasive force of nothingness within real beings and throughout reality. This bonding taking place between the nothingness and existence suggests then that the elevation from nothingness does not signify a distinct ontological phase. Moreover, The placing of the difference between being and nothingness at the foundation of the philosophical framework is now given its proper significance. This is an inclusive difference rather than an exclusive one. As such, the distinction between being and nothingness does not hinder their merging together within reality. Now we proceed to the second structure of selfness. One of the unique terms within the vocabulary of reality suggested in Konrad Martis's Phenomenology concerns the selfness that signifies a pure ontological core of real existence as such. Konrad Martis explained that as opposed to real beings depicted as possessing selfness of being and establishing themselves as a complete and positive existence from the outset, ideal beings are selfless existences, such that by their very becoming sink into mere formal existence. She goes so far as to argue that without the element of the self, there could be no existence, indeed no world. The connectedness of the ontological element of the self possessed by real beings to being is then depicted as selfful groundness of being. The constitutive selfness of the real beings provide them with an essential necessity, builds up their substance, and establishes the self-belonging of being to itself. Finally, just as regarding nothingness, also the invisibility of selfness of being is primarily associated with the dimension of internality that is inherent in their self. In this regard, Konrad Martis explains that in every true existence lies an internal potentiality for being of its own, which is a self-centered element. So now, based on the view of real beings as possessing selfness, Konrad Martis established her perception of the spiritual I as subject to an ancient movement between two ontological forces operating simultaneously within it. The first one is referred to as originalness, and the other I translate it as Ursprungshaftigkeit, and the second as spiritualness, which is geistlich-heftig. Consequently, the I being is depicted as elevating itself from itself towards itself outwardly and into itself inwardly. I should have more time to explore this point, but I think in that respect, having her a perception of the I, which she deliberately referred to not as the ego. She says explicitly we cannot go through this ego of Husserl. She suggests a realist perception of the self, and for her, this is in a way put to end prejudice that realists have no interest in the self, which is a well-established prejudice. Anyway, so let's say something about this originalness element within the I. The originalness concerns the I as being that which cannot get out of itself or out of its own origin. It is entirely origin, depth, ground level, abyss. Thus, as pure origin, the spiritual I cannot have any outside itself. Rather, its own originalness signifies that the selfness of the I being is fundamentally is inside itself. Therefore, unlike the selfness of typifying animals and material beings that is entirely realized outwardly, the selfness of the I being is personful and is ultimately towards being, to the point of incapability to escape from being, inescapability, renouncing and surrendering to it. This is but the selfful relation to being typical of the I being that develops positively inside itself. The selfness characterizing the I being compresses it, so to speak, into its own origin and thereby consolidates its robust internality as originalness, which is of course invisible. The second force of the spiritual, referred to as spiritualness, operating within the I being introduces another mode of invisibility, standing in somehow paradoxical relation to its predecessor, is also referred to as infrastasis. This aspect of the I being indicates its peculiar faculty to be directed to something other than itself, outside itself or beyond itself. Thereby, the I being is manifested as selfless or as totally empty of itself down to its most internal ground, which is precisely therefore an abyss. From ontological perspective, as infrastasis, the I being is portrayed as possessing an unlimited freedom and power and as standing against itself. Konrad Martius explained, by being nothing in itself, it is capable of being everything. Since nothing falls back upon it, it is capable of grasping everything and constantly new things, because it can never be burdened, enclosed, or locked by the fullness it grasps. It remains open to the possibility, choice, and freedom towards all things. So similar to real beings, also the I being is portrayed as elevating itself from itself outwardly towards itself and inwardly into itself. However, Konrad Martius clarifies that no mutual exclusion or convergence into a unity of the two is possible. Furthermore, she underscored that such a possibility would cancel the entire ontological meaning of the matter. Hence, the two components of the I being must persist in their distinctness and separateness. Again, her illuminating words. It is clear that this is indeed our specific opinion, that the situation includes both aspects within itself, that only together do they constitute the one concrete ontic unity that finite existence represents. It is not a matter of opposition that could be unified dialectically. So now we proceed to our third and last ontological structure of the transcendence. So first, in her dissertation from 1913, Konrad Martius establishes the reality of transcendence while distinguish it explicitly from transcendence of the external world. She says the following: real transcendence does not refer to a factual separateness, but rather to an essential separateness grounded in the difference of spheres, which cannot be undone in principle. As an object is truly transcendent in relation to another when it possesses a distinctive inner structure and occupies an existence position that is in principle unreachable by the other. So I put in the blue the aspect that I want to highlight here. So real transcendence is characterized then by four fundamental traits: separateness, inner structure, existence position, and unreachability. Moreover, unlike the transcendence of the external world or externality in general, which represents a mode of appearance and stand in relation to consciousness, real transcendence does not appear at all. It remains invisible. Also, the aspect of inaccessibility to human spirit, although almost implicitly embedded in the structures of nothingness and selfness, becomes an explicit element in the ontological structure of real transcendence. Konrad Martius explained, what is close must be accessible to something internally similar at the point of its close existence. However, what is open, and this means being able to enter into an objective relationship with all being, implies that it is outside the possibility of any real relationship within the truly existence. It is really, in reality, transcendent to it. Obviously, the requirement for encountering something of the same nature as Gleiche, as a condition for accessibility, cannot be fulfilled in relation to real transcendence. Simply put, the real transcendence that conforms to an essential closeness that is closed off from the view and therefore is invisible. Finally, Conrad-Matthias draws a clear line separating between real transcendence that closed off the spirit and is fundamentally unreachable, and the transcendence engaged in the epistemic processes that presupposes the openness of spiritual entity of the I being. She puts it as follows. The real transcendence in relation to consciousness must be distinguished from the I, from the beyond the I of something that does not belong to it. Having said that, we proceed to the section of the discussion. You see the tree, here is the discussion. The tree structure and the discussion span an all-encompassing scope of reality. Nothingness precedes any real entity, selfness pertains to the human experience, and transcendence addresses what exists beyond human reality and the world externally. The ontological framework in its simplest form offers a fundamental starting point for the exploration of invisibility, placing nothingness, selfness, and transcendence on a shared plane. Nevertheless, I would like to argue that each of the three hold distinct implications on the understanding of invisibility within reality. So I didn't say epilogue. So I arranged it with a table, start with the nothingness. Nothingness presents the most basic layer of invisibility, where it is significantly identified with the hidden interiority into which invisibility is compressed, a compression that forms a substantive dimension of invisibility. In short, nothing exists in all being, the nothing exists in all being, but is unmanifested, that is, invisible. Just as nothingness marks the primordial layer of reality or being, so too can nothingness, understood in this way, serve as a foundation for the phenomenology of invisibility. Simply put, if nothingness exists, so does the invisible. This suggests that appearance is not an ultimate indicator of reality, and thus reality can be internal, in other words, invisible. The study of invisibility advanced through a purification of the dimension of nothingness and being within the I being. The originalness of the I being holds the aspect of substantial interiority of its selfness simultaneously as the spiritualness of the I being acquire external dimension and is not only open to what lies beyond itself, but also triggered to separate from its inwardly compressed origin. However, both aspects of spiritual I are relevant to the discourse on invisibility implied in Conrad-Matthias's thinking. Originality denotes internal thinking, while spiritualness outlines the state of dispersion within spirit. However, precisely because nothing can penetrate the gap between originalness and spiritualness, and as the possibility for unity between the two aspect is excluded, the I being emerges as the keystone situated between the two other ontological structures. Through nothingness embedded within being and through its through its originalness, it is embedded within being, and through its spiritualness, it transcends beyond itself, thereby connecting with transcendence, where it finds the ultimate realization for its capability for infrastasis. Conrad-Matthias designates this almost ungraspable position of the I being as follows. Where no transition can occur, a transition exists. Where no inception is possible, such an inception is present. Where there is no ground for being, but only an abyss, or rather the groundlessness of non-being, something rises towards being and towards itself, as if it were its own ground within being. Does this peculiar stance of the I being signifies the defeat of the invisibility inherent within its ontological structure? Conrad-Matthias' response is unequivocal. No. Something attempts to sneak in here. Something that does not remove the nothingness underlying being, but on the contrary, only makes it more glaring. We have already seen that in the initial original elevation towards being. That is why we direct our gaze towards the immeasurability and infinitely filled abyss and groundlessness of being. Yet, even this mere fullness of being does not carry us away from boundaries of nothingness. So the most mature, I would say, now we proceed to the last section. The most mature phase of invisibility is apparent regarding transcendence, which appears to radicalize the elements of invisibility included within the other ontological structures. Thus, in its mode of appearance, so to speak, transcendence echoes the simple sense of non-appearance typical of the nothingness, while regarding selfness, transcendence takes forward the infrastasis to the point of constituting a new sphere of invisibility. Also, the implied subsidiary of the aspect of intelligibility is made explicitly and positively articulated as closeness to consciousness. Furthermore, while the aspect of interiority did not work elevation to real world regarding nothingness and selfness, transcendence is devoid of any internal dimension, and externality is established as its ultimate inherent characteristic. Indeed, being rooted in distinct sphere, invisibility is established as a radical aspect of ontological structure of transcendence. Hence, externality and invisibility do not exclude each other. So the discussed shared feature of the invisibility reinforced the understanding that Konrad Matthäus's phenomenological realism is not concerned with the immediate concrete or material dimension within reality, within which reality might be manifest under certain conditions. Rather, invisibility as the mode of appearing proper to nothingness, selfness, and transcendence establish the possibility for a fundamental discontinuity between real phenomena and their appearance within reality. The metaphysical aspect of Konrad Matthäus's phenomenological thinking presses exactly on this observation of discontinuity within reality. Furthermore, this essential and persisting invisibility characterizing the elucidated ontological structure amounts to the understanding of invisibility as offering a fundamental gateway to reality. That is a datum point where a radical overcoming of mere formal positioning of reality takes place. At the same time, each of the structures does not rest on the other. Rather, their ontological explication suggests that nothingness, selfness, and transcendence are three invisible gateways to reality interacting with one another. So, this is the idea of being gateways to reality. I proceed now to a few short epilogue. The elaboration of nothingness, selfness, and transcendence as ontological structures of invisibility might hastily lead to the perception that they belong to on the same plane of visible phenomena. However, this conclusion overlooks the complex understanding of the phenomenon of invisibility as a fundamental operative dimension of reality. Again, I draw here on Eugen Fink's operative concept within reality. There is a lot to say about that. And I think this is actually the method proper to the phenomenon of invisibility. This is for another conference. So, invisibility is, I want to say that invisibility is an operative dimension within reality. Namely, invisibility should be approached as an element through which the philosophical thinking is taught, rather than as an established philosophical concept considered in its own right. Therefore, unlike phenomena, was moreover more appearing allow for straightforward thematization, approaching invisibility demands an investigation into the themes laying in depth of reality and to significant extent resist thematization. I hope that the revealed complexity of the invisible modes of appearing makes it clear why there is no established concept of invisibility proposed in Konrad Matthäus's thinking. Thank you.
Questions?
Please.
Olga? Yeah, go ahead.
Ronny, thank you very much. You clarified a lot for me what her role was within phenomenological movement. We had the with Jeremy and others, we had the webinar on Conrad Marcel's in James Hart's reading, and I left puzzled, and now I think I have a little bit more clarity. And in that context, I wanted to ask you, what was the relationship between her body of work and Heidegger? But it seems that Heidegger borrowed a lot from her. And chronologically, it is possible. We know nothing about it. So
look, there is a lot. Heidegger borrowed. To say the word borrowed is actually a positive word. He simply leaned on many structures that are, it's not something to prove. I mean, she published them within her dissertation from 1913, published in Husserl's Jahrbuch in 1916. And in the second edition of the book, I added a new chapter, and it's called the Phenomenology of the Nothing. And I show how Heidegger leans on the foundation of her thinking, and it's very explicit. I'm happy to share for anybody who's interested.
great.
But it's not only that. I mean, there are many structures that Heidegger borrowed from her, and I think what makes it first of all, she's a tough lady. I mean, it's not easy to grasp her thinking. She actually, one of the many contributions by her is she suggests that we should finish the fight with natural scientists. We should find a way to talk with them. And I think it's very important and even pressing nowadays, but this is very important. She takes from Husserl so many things, but she takes it to her own big project. What makes a presentation, I think, I read Konrad Martius, she had, well, this is the power of being marginal. Since she was banned because of her Jewish roots, and she could not be habilitated in Germany, and there was a war, and etc., etc. So she simply wrote a huge, amazing volume of writing. Only about 10, 20 books of them were published, but a great volume is still waiting for publication, including re-Ontology. What was published in Husserl's Jahrbuch was just 2 of 5 sections. And there is a fight on the right. It's a long story. I'm happy to share with you. Anyway, I think there is a foundational work of her which deals with phenomenology. And later on, she explored the idea of biology. She disputed with the quantum physics. She explored the idea of cosmology. And I think while you can really understand with lots of efforts, the layer of her phenomenology, which is until the mid-30s, what happens later, you cannot read them without this basic layer, but you can well understand the project without going to that cosmology if you're not interested in. I think James Hart, he wrote the first dissertation in English in 1970s, and this was on the theology and cosmology. This is okay, but I found it crucial to start from the most elementary foundation, which I see as extremely rich and illuminating, also very to our very time about how we can have the reality. And I think it's so.
Thank you. Yes.
Then first one.
Yeah, I'm wondering about thinking a little bit about her concept of nothingness. Just wondering more historically rather than more than anything. Is she drawing on the Parmenidean distinction between absolute and relative nothingness? So Duquesne and Miron.
No, I think she as I mentioned, I just mentioned in the sentence, she for her, on the face of it, it appears that as a kind of suggesting a formal ontology in the spirit of Aristotle on the ancient. But the point is not that, because for her, we should try to account for reality without the use of the relation to consciousness, and without the use, and in a way, this beginning in Parmenides for her was somehow contaminated with the so many epistemological efforts of idealism and so forth, that so she tries to avoid it. She suggests that there is a real nothingness, as I said, to the point of what exists is a question, is a paradox, because for her this is the substance of everything, and she has a lot to say about this nothing. Again, for her, I mentioned, it's all written to the drawer. She did not have the opportunity to discuss things with colleagues, with students, etc. So what I do is somehow to read more into her, because she kind of encapsulates things with rhetorical questions, assuming that one can complete, but it's not the case. So yes, the nothingness is a real layer within reality. It is not only a real layer, it is operative, it's an active layer, and this is actually what explains the finitude. Because she says there is an extraordinary proximity between being and nothing, and this is actually what brings about the finitude or finite reality, because they are so close and so near to nothingness by their very being. So they started from nothingness. The nothing is still pervading within it, and they are about to meet it at last stage.
That's true.
Yeah, really riveting. Wanted to, so you gave 3 categories of ontological, I forget exactly the title.
I suggest them. I mean, it's not discussed under any title of invisibility, or for this conference, I thought, how can I read the phenomenon of invisibility into first of all, this is, I would say, we can actually elaborate it as a methodology how to study invisibility. So the first stage is just to discern and uncover what are the phenomena that might be relevant to invisibility.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So this is what I found on her. This is true. There are more, but these are the major.
Oh, I meant more the nothingness, selfness, and so you set up these ontological categories.
Yes.
So I was just curious why you didn't use the word phenomenology there. So why they're not phenomenological categories or something to this effect? Because you might argue, I would argue that ontology is downstream from phenomenology. Like, we have no access to pure concept, right? So like is there a reason why you chose the word ontology there?
It's a good question. First of all, I mean, for Conrad Matters, ontology is a way to display beings in the world, existence in the world, something that is there, outside there, independent of my consciousness. So, and to talk, I mean, the word phenomenology for her at that time is somehow contaminated with this Husserl's turn towards transcendental idealism. It's not that she avoids this word. And also in a very, really a noble piece introductory to Reinach's writing, she writes an introduction where she established what is for her phenomenology. And for her, phenomenology is this stepping back and letting things appear and restraining yourself from staining them with your mental expectations, interpretations, and so forth. So this is the point, and also it is explored in the book in chapter called The Vocabulary of Reality. She faces the situation that while the idealist discourse is so rich by its vocabulary, the realist one is really in need for words. And what she suggests is actually the words, how we can communicate reality. So I suggested this nothingness, selfness, and transcendence. But there I use words like wedding between the nothing and the being, homeland, the place that being find in reality. So many things, words that are not explored as distinct concepts, but actually operate as a vocabulary helping her access reality, not via exploring the structures of consciousness. It's not that she dismissed the idea of intentionality, but she says this is something, she said, on the contrary, we should study consciousness in this realistic way, and not the other way around. Study consciousness in order to understand reality, but on the other way around. You have to study consciousness via its operation within reality, its indication within reality. And what she revealed there is that there are gaps, obscurity, darkness, so many, I would say, spheres that are not populated with being or with understanding or with anything. And she says, okay, we are there. On those, these are the places where we should press in order to find out what is reality, which is, I mean, this is to ask what is reality, what can be broader than this question. But then slowly, she provides means. And
just picking up on what you said there, it almost sounds like a reprise of sort of classical metaphysics and special metaphysics, when you take such a realist approach first to the world and then to the mode of consciousness through the engagement with the world. Is that kind of part of Hedwig Conrad-Martius' project? I'm not very familiar with her work. And if it isn't, what's kind of like the distinction there that kind of is differentiating her from, say, you know, classical metaphysics of people like Thomas Aquinas, for example?
I say, first of all, there are two, I would say, two explicit poles that she stands against them and explore her thinking via criticizing them. The first one is positivism, which is she adores the immediate accessibility to reality, and there is a well-known when she entered the scene of phenomenology when she, at the age of 21, she won an academic prize at the University of Göttingen. Many of you might know that it was an anonymous submission, and they were sure, the committee was sure that this is a brilliant professor from Leipzig submitting this envelope, and eventually it turned out that this is this young 21 girl that looks like the age of 12. that won the prize, and by the way, her fiance canceled their future marriage because of that. She said he wants me to bake him cakes. So she understood, luckily on time, that she avoided this path and correct her path. And then she, by the way, she chose much better. She chose the philosopher Theodor Conrad, who realized, well, of the two of us, she is the more talented, so I'll support her career and she'll be the one, the philosopher of the house. So it's a long story. Anyway.
You go, girl.
So this is the positivism where she started, and then this idealism. Her argumentation regarding idealism very much recalling Husserl's start of in the crisis. She says, how can we accuse idealism? How can we reject it? It provided us with such a marvelous world, just as Husserl would say in the crisis. But then she says, the problem with idealism that it robs us of the world. And the world is not only a world that is comprehensible. For her, the world is something that includes, I would say, islands of comprehensibility, but it is a being, or I don't want to say a place. She has a space theory of her own, but within which comprehensibility might be appeared. By the way, she distinguished, I did not go too deeply to her relation to Husserl's essence intuition, but while Husserl stick at the beginning to the essence intuition, she distinguished between existence and essences. She says existences can be understood thanks to the essence that is embedded in them, but essences are ultimately independent because they don't have this burden of reality. For her, the core, the big thing is reality. And as I said, the way I see it for her, the most inspiring, igniting philosophically is the drama of the real. Something become real, not especially understandable, but real is there, out there. I think we somehow lost this sense of being.
That's what's saying.
You said there was two polls real quick. The one poll was the
Idea, it's not the poll, actually there is a sequence. She started with the criticism of positivism and then proceeded to idealism, but by the end she explores a very perception of, for example, biology and the world in a very intimate relation with the natural sciences. What her husband was testimony wrote after she died, that what she would either write her things or read idealism and research in natural sciences. She was informed to the last publication on that. God knows how they could read all these volumes.
So you're saying,
We have a question online.
Okay.
Please.
They asked if they could voice their question. So if you're willing to work with the laptop speakers, then
Please.
all right, Randolph, you are free to unmute yourself and ask.
All right, I hope you can hear me okay. Does this work?
Hi, Randall.
Hey, Ronny, thank you. This is amazing. I really appreciate your talk. My question concerns the drama of the real that you just brought up again, the drama of the real, and in particular, this real elevation, right? And the achievement of this finished infrastasis. Anyway, all this stuff, relation between nothingness and being and the coming into being of reality. In this, my question is regarding this imagery of wedding, the bond and the wedding, the word, the idea that she invokes. I'm curious about the mysteries of Konrad Martius, about she and Theodor Konrad and this Phenomenologenheim where they lived at. You know, there's a real esoteric, maybe even kind of in its own way occult dimension to this. And part of the idea of the invisible structures that she can see with this spiritual seeing is potentially a way of illustrating the place between the real, this room, this conference, this hybrid conference aspect of it that I'm encountering right now in this room, the reality, and ultimate reality, which is this, you know, nothingness and being and these kind of primordial ontological structures. And when they come together in this like holographic infrastasis or whatever you want to call this, there's this imagery of a wedding. And there's actually this occurrence of a wedding. And I'm just hearing you now mention breaking off of an engagement with a guy who wanted her to bake cakes. I mean, this is really interesting, you know, perhaps mundane historical fact, but I'm wondering about, you know, the drama of creation and the wedding and maybe even the wedding night that is creation right here somehow in this like mystical, invisible realm somewhere between reality and ultimate reality.
we have 1 minute.
So I try to put it briefly. First of all, I think that the wedding concerns having two different distinct people coming up together to some being. There is a being of being a couple, but this is, don't take too far this metaphor of wedding, because I've explored it in the book, you might see. But the point is, which I think it's relevant to this context, is that for Konrad Martius, this drama occurs within every real being. So it is not necessarily different regarding the divine and their existent concrete thing. This, the operative force of invisible, of dark things within reality pervades all universe, yes? So I think in this regard, there is the divine, the phenomenon of the divine this chair should be approached with the same logic. I think what I wanted to stress here, that Conrad Masters did not establish a concept of invisibility. She says, if you have this spiritual organ, you are able to see it. There is no way to instruct you how to get there. I suggest that this principle should be a guiding principle for exploring a phenomenology of invisibility based on the beginnings that I tried to sketch here in her thinking, but not only that. First of all, we have to map the phenomenon that we see this peculiar mechanism of hiddenness or darkness and manifestness, and to see how we can first place them and then proceed to the second stage of analyzing them via this method of essence intuition, etc. I want to thank you dearly for your attention.